Yeah.
I'm on. Good evening. Hello. Can you hear me? Am I just going to shout? All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Duncan Turner. I'm General Partner here at SOSV. We are the first check into deep tech, backing founders in planetary and human health. I am joined by my co-host, 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐴 Hoffman, who's also General Partner at SOSV. Both of us run HACS, which is our deep tech ecosystem for physical sciences companies in Newark, New Jersey. Please do come and visit us. For those of you who have not, it's not that scary. It's just over the river.
New Jersey's not that bad.
Physical sciences, that's hardware and chemistry. We're investing in companies in the energy transition sector, in industrial resilience, and also healthcare. Tonight, we are kicking off the SOSV Deep Tech Live sessions. This is going to be a series of conversations with some of the thought leaders and most prominent people in deep tech. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Jesse Jenkins. Welcome. A world expert in the energy transition, energy systems modeling, grid decarbonization, and US industrial strategy. He is the professor at Princeton University. There's a lot you've done here. I don't know how you do this. He is at the 𝙂𝙤𝙞𝙣 Center for Energy and Environment, director of the Zero Lab, which is the Zero Carbon Energy Systems Research and Optimization Laboratory, host of my now favorite podcast, 𝐂𝐿𝐵, which is really at the intersection of policy and technology as it relates to the energy transition. For those of you who have not listened to it, I highly recommend it. It's fantastic. It's weekly. And described by Time Magazine as the scorekeeper for America's clean energy transition, helping to quantify the real impact the Inflation Reduction Act has had. Tonight's conversation is particularly timely. I don't know if any of you have been looking at the news over the past 30 days. We have a lot to talk about. I will attempt to break stereotypes and be the optimistic British person. 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐴 will continue to be the optimistic Californian. And we're going to get into it. Just one note, this is going to be live streamed on LinkedIn and YouTube. It will also be available over the next couple of days. If you loved it so much you want to rewatch it, you can do that in a few days. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to 𝐂𝐤𝐤𝐴. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan, and thank you so much for joining us,
Good
Jesse.
to be here. Yeah.
So I guess let's get right into it. There is a 1,000-pound elephant, and we can get there soon, but we're starting with optimism. What did the Biden administration climate push really accomplish, and what are some of the key milestones and impact that you've seen?
Yeah. So the basic strategy that was implemented under the Biden administration by the 117th Congress, not the most recent one, but the one before that, when Democrats controlled both chambers, was to basically put clean energy on sale for Americans, right? So we somehow need to switch the, or tilt the economic playing field for the millions of different decisions that you and I are making about how we're going to heat our homes or drive our kids to school or bike our kids to school, how businesses are going to move forward and make their energy purchasing decisions and everything else. And the only way to really do that is with broad economic incentives. So there's been a push to price carbon for a long time, right? Some places like the UK and California have been more successful than others. But that of course raises energy costs for people in the near term, and that's a pretty difficult political sell, especially at the national level in the US. And so the strategy that Congress took was to instead make clean energy cheap. Right? So we're going to put clean energy on sale, 10, 20, 30, 40% off, with a set of tax credits, grants, loan guarantees, rebates, et cetera, for pretty much the full portfolio of technologies and solutions that you would want to see scaling up to address climate change across all the major emitting sectors. Some more heavily subsidized or supported and more extensively than others. I'd say agriculture and industry are kind of lagging compared to transportation and buildings and power, which are really heavily supported by the IRA. And the net effect of that is really to probably deploy on the order of $500 billion of public investment and support to multiply that probably 3- or 4-fold to drive a couple $1 trillion in total investment over the next decade in building out the clean energy economy in the US and accelerating the uptake of these technologies. And so that has a huge catalytic effect at pulling in emerging technologies in the market and particularly scaling technologies that are ready to, for prime time now. And so that most of the emissions reductions progress in the near term is going to come from technologies that are already mature and can absorb $1 trillion of investment, right? And so that mostly is wind, solar, and batteries on the grid, and electric vehicles in our transportation fleet. But that's about half of the total emissions reductions that we estimate from the repeat project, which I run, that assesses these bills. But the other half is across all the other major emitting sectors. So it really does touch everything: agriculture, industry, buildings, et cetera. And in sum, we estimate that the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure law, as well as some of the final regulations that the Biden administration put in place on, say, tailpipe emissions or power plants, are enough to take the rate of decarbonization in the US from about 1% per year to somewhere around 2.5% to 3% per year. So more than double, almost triple the rate of decarbonization. So on the one hand, that's really impressive, right? We really are putting the pedal to the metal. On the other hand, that's only about half of what you would want to do if you were on track for net zero by 2050, which is our long-term goal. So it basically did half of the work we needed, with 1-2 year, spell of Congress, and that's a pretty big accomplishment. But unfortunately, we needed to be doing more and continuing that progress. And of course, with the change in administration, that is now much, much more difficult.
So you estimated that we, under IRA, could by 2032 reduce 1 billion tons per year. So we're not close to that. We're halfway there.
So that's the impact from the IRA. But if you wanted to be on track for net zero, we would need to do 2. So yeah, we're falling behind our 2030 NDC, our nationally determined contribution, so our pledge at the UN Climate Convention on how much the US is going to reduce emissions, was to cut our emissions to half of peak levels by 2030. That target is now out of reach, and it was pulling out of reach even at the end of the Biden administration. A straight line path to net zero would actually not quite get to that level in 2030 either, so sort of accelerating the pace on the front end. But even there, we're falling behind that kind of pathway. And so, there's more to be done. We can do a lot in the power sector with light-duty vehicles, but that's only a portion of the overall emissions pie, and we need to be doing a lot more.
Which bits did well versus which ones didn't do so well within? You're not being amplified.
Yeah.
Which bits did well versus which did not do so well within the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah, so I mean, probably the most substantial policy support is for long-term tax credits for clean electricity and storage deployment. We've had these production tax credits and investment tax credits for a long time that have supported wind and solar as they've gone from kind of these expensive alternative niche technologies to being the cheapest way to get and fastest way to get new power on the grid today. But they were always expiring every few years, and that made it very hard to do long-term planning. It made it very risky to develop projects. If you couldn't get them started or finished on time, you would lose out on this important revenue stream. And it made it really hard to build a manufacturing supply chain as well, because who's going to invest in a factory, all the capital required for that if you don't know if your market's going to go poof 2 years from now, right? So the IRA modified those incentives so that they're in place now, and they're now available for all carbon-free electricity technologies. So new nuclear would qualify as well. You can, whereas solar used to only be eligible for the investment tax credit, you can now choose ITC or PTC depending on what's better for your project economics. And they extended it for the first time to storage. So batteries, lithium-ion batteries and other energy storage can receive an investment tax credit too. And they're in place for the long term, unless Congress repeals them. The law currently reads that these tax credits are in place at their full value until 2033, or the year that we cut power sector emissions to 25% of 2022 levels, so 75% cut, whichever comes later. And in our estimation, because of demand growth, that horizon keeps receding, and we probably won't hit that target until the late 2030s anyway. And those are commenced construction deadlines. So you turn a shovel, get your substation started. You have 4 years you're grandfathered in to claim that credit to complete your project. So really what we've done is put in place a tax credit that cuts the cost of deploying clean electricity and batteries by 30 to 50% through 2040. So long-term incentive horizon. And that's going to really transform the economics of the sector, again, if it stays in place. The other one, which probably doesn't need to be permanent and is having more of a catalytic role, is the tax credits for electric vehicles. So the new clean vehicles tax credits for consumers, personal tax credits, and business tax credits are an important catalyst to drive down the upfront cost of EVs so that they're closer to parity or even below the cost of internal combustion cars. And that just makes it a smart economic decision for people. So you don't have to be an early adopter that's excited by the tech, or a green, liberal that wants to, do good. It's just a better car for a lower price. And we're not going to see mass adoption unless that's true. And that will be true eventually as the cost of batteries declines, and they're continuing to decline. But we're basically accelerating that point with these subsidies. And those are in place right now through 2032. It takes $7,500 off the top of the upfront cost of a vehicle. More than that, up to $40,000 for a commercial vehicle like a bus or a heavy-duty truck. Those are big incentives. And again, those are having huge impacts on consumer and business purchases, but also investment in the manufacturing supply chain. So we've got over $100 billion of manufacturing investment already under construction, operating, or planned for the next few years, and about 100,000 jobs in manufacturing now in the battery and EV supply chain that wouldn't have been there if not for these interventions.
And before we get into what we're dealing with now, do you have any insight on the kind of geographic areas where some of that is taking place?
Yeah, so the manufacturing is really interesting. It's spread out quite, across the country. So some of it obviously is in places like Michigan that have been historic homes for auto manufacturing, or Ohio. But a lot of it is sort of in this battery belt. It's pretty large region, so it's hard to kind of group them together. But that includes a huge facility that that Ford is building in Tennessee, the Blue Oval City. There's a massive Ohio facility that Honda is opening up later this year. Hyundai and Kia both have major manufacturing plants, along with supported battery investments in Georgia. Tesla, of course, is in Nevada and in Texas. So really broadly spread across a variety of states, and almost exclusively in Republican represented districts or states, right? So that's creating real economic headwinds for tailwinds for communities, revitalizing and creating economic opportunity in a wide range of dozens of communities across the country. And so ideally that would continue. And unfortunately, if these credits are rolled back, a lot of that investment is in peril. And so we're at a pretty tenuous moment right now.
So have you modeled any of, well, not to go too deep into the tenuous, but given that we are in the situation and seeing what we're seeing,
Yep.
We're just a month in. It already feels
It's hard to believe it's only been
feels
4 weeks
like
or
a
so.
long time.
Yeah.
But that was quite hopeful that a lot of the work
Yep.
that's been done is already taking root. What do you foresee, or any of the modeling you've done, that the impact of this administration's cuts and/or reversal of policy will have?
Yeah, so it's still, I think, too early to tell, and we are gearing up the repeat project to be ready when there are real concrete proposals coming. I'd say going into the administration, I had a view that the Biden administration had worked their tails off to commit as much of the discretionary funding under the bill. So there was a couple $100 billion in grants and loan programs, rebates. The rest, probably $300 or $400 billion was in tax credits. So those are sort of self-executing once you make the guidance. And they had completed almost all of the tax credit guidances that they needed to by the end of 2024. But there was all this discretionary money, and the concern was that when Trump comes in and changes leadership at the agencies, they wouldn't use that funding or would put it to different purposes. And so the Biden administration worked very hard, very quickly, a lot of diligent civil servants, trying to get funding committed to various parties and execute those grants and loan guarantees and other things. And my assumption going in was that the U.S. government would respect contract law and would honor those commitments, as a government typically does, and that money, roughly 85% of that would be sort of safe. So that's, there's a big chunk of it that's on its way, it's doing its job. Tax credits require legislative repeal, and the Republicans basically can only afford to lose 2 or 3 votes on any issue right now in either the House or the Senate. And that means they basically need unanimity to do anything. And while they are going to be bringing up a tax credit, bill that will try to be extending the tax cuts that Trump and Republicans initiated in 2017 that are expiring later this year, And they've talked about potentially using Inflation Reduction Act credit repeal as a pay-for to try to offset some small fraction of the $4.5+ trillion that they plan to insert in that bill. I think it's going to be very difficult in practice for them to do that. So I came into the administration feeling pretty optimistic about the continuation of most of, maybe say 85% of what we had accomplished over the last 4 years. Obviously, repeals of regulations, the EPA has implemented are likely, and they weren't expected to be as durable in any case. What has floored me is how little regard the administration has had for the statutory authority that they have, or even the contractual obligations that the government has entered into. And so, folks have probably been reading about these freezes of allocations of not just pending grant proposals or money that hasn't been obligated, but already obligated funds. Funds that have been promised to, in many cases under contract to hundreds and thousands of counterparties across the country. People have been spending money counting on that rebate coming in, or that refund coming in for the government. People have hired people, ordered long lead time items, right? Transformers and equipment like that. And now they're not sure whether they're going to get paid out by the US government, right? And if you don't have faith in the US government to honor contracts, that's a pretty deep fundamental shakeup of the US economy as a whole, but in particular it does call into question how much of that discretionary funding will actually make it out there. Now I hope again that the courts will continue to push back on that as they've done, and that in time, as this sort of chaotic period gives way, agencies will continue to execute their obligations. But I'm much less certain of that than I was 30 days ago.
Me too.
Yeah.
Well, I think that Duncan was going to talk a little bit about manufacturing.
Oh,
and
I can.
You did just point to some of the risks in the U.S., but the narrative is that we want to remain competitive, and that is a big component of energy dominance and everything that this administration is going towards. It would be interesting to hear on some specifics there and kind of the counter narrative.
Sure. So I guess if I look at this, trying to look optimistically, the end goal of both administrations is fairly similar in that you want to shore up a really good, resilient industrial supply chain within the US, and you want to lower energy prices / inflation.
Yeah.
However, they've got two completely different ways of going about this: a stick versus a carrot,
Yep.
tariffs versus incentives. And so I just wonder, in the long term, which of these, how do you see the differences between those two strategies playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I should say there's less difference really even than just carrots versus sticks, because the one area of policy that the Biden administration carried over from the Trump administration was some strategic tariffs on a variety of products, including in the energy sector. And that included tariffs, and in the end days of the administration, new tariffs, 100% import duties, which is just embarrassing for the US auto sector, on Chinese electric vehicle imports, or vehicle imports period, but particularly with an eye towards electric vehicles. I think a 35% duty on batteries imported from China. And there was an extension, a final decision to put in place what had previously been waived anti-dumping tariffs on solar from Southeast Asian importing countries or exporting countries. So there was a lot of this continuation, in certain areas, but much more strategically targeted than simply saying, all imports, or Canada and Mexico, or the entire EU with a 10% tariff. So there were some sticks used in that context as well. But what the Biden administration and Congress was trying to do was to subsidize and support the production in the United States, so that instead of implementing a tariff and then having domestic production rise to the price of the now tariffed import, we could actually undercut that in the US and potentially produce at a lower price point. And as we build industries at scale and improve productivity of US manufacturing, then that subsidy would be less and less necessary over time, ideally, right? That would be the successful outcome of an industrial strategy. Again, on the surface, the Trump administration shares many of the same goals, but is going about it by saying they're going to, again, maybe they may not be able to, but saying they're going to upend most of the manufacturing subsidies. They're revisiting even the CHIPS and Science Act grants that have been awarded. That was announced this week. potentially change the terms of those grants. And they're implementing broad tariffs on everything, not just areas where we have a strategic interest in growing domestic production. Again, or at least they're saying they're going to. Not a lot has concretely been implemented yet, right? And many of the tariff threats have been rolled back, at least temporarily. So I'm trying to, separate the noise from the signal. I do think, though, that in Trump's mind, it's hard to get in his mind, he seems to be expressing a view that tariffs are an important source of external revenue, right? This is the way he's framed it. They have to raise more money if they're going to continue to cut taxes for corporations, lowering corporate tax rates, and for, very wealthy top income tier earners, and add on some of the new proposed tax cuts around not taxing tips or Social Security income. That's going to cost like $4 to $7 trillion over 10 years. And there's no pay for that. And so even repealing the entirety of the IRA would be like $500 billion. So it's a drop in the bucket. And they won't be able to succeed at repealing all of it. So I think he views tariffs as a way to raise revenue, and that Americans don't pay those. Somebody else does. Canada does, China does, Mexico does. The reality, of course, is that depending on the industry, that tariff is passed through or shared to some degree between the exporter, the importer, and the final consumer, and that's us Americans, right? So these will be very inflationary policies that will drive up costs of a lot of end products that we all use and that businesses use throughout the supply chains of all kinds of industries. Not to mention, adding a lot of chaos around, trying to reorient, reshuffle supply chains to deal with this new, unexpected set of tariffs. So, he's got his vision of what happens in his mind, but then there's the reality of it, which is that I think a lot of Americans end up paying that cost indirectly. And it does pretty substantial damage to the U.S. economy. So again, I think the markets seem to think he's bluffing, right? If you look at how they react to these announcements, they've tended to not plummet as much as I would expect if they thought it was serious. But I don't know. I'm starting to believe he thinks it, and maybe he's just a really good poker player, and I've been, convinced by the bluff. But there's so many of these proposals, and he's not walking all of them back. And I think we are heading into a very different regime where, the free trade era that ruled from 1984 to 2024 is over.
Do you see any upsides for anyone in this world of tariffs, particularly in the energy transition?
Again, if designed in conjunction with a domestic industrial strategy for specific industries that we want to protect for some strategic reason and help grow, tariffs are fine in that purpose, right? Under that in that role. But broad-based general tariffs, it's hard to say. Just take the automotive sector. If in theory, we've shed a lot of manufacturing jobs, right, from the automotive sector to Canada and Mexico under NAFTA. We import some products from Hyundai, Hyundai cars from Korea or Toyota from Japan. And this would help, re-onshore more of that manufacturing. On the other hand, if you make vehicles, 30% more expensive, it's going to have a huge effect on demand. And so the overall demand for vehicles is going to plummet. And, who gets hurt there? Probably U.S. manufacturers, right? And employment at U.S. manufacturing facilities. So does one outweigh the other? I don't know, but it's awfully disruptive to do it that way. I do think there is I had a Shift Key episode on this a couple weeks ago with Ellen Hughes-Cromwick, who's the former chief economist at GM, talking through what would happen if we actually did put tariffs on automotive imports, particularly from Canada and Mexico. And the one silver lining there maybe is that because of the policies implemented by the IRA and the infrastructure law, there has been a major focus on making sure that the EV supply chain, this new supply chain we're building, electric lithium-ion batteries and electric vehicle assembly, is much more domesticated, much more American than the current supply chain. And these are new capital investments coming, and so they have more flexibility, right, to move than an existing sunk asset, or you already built a plant in Mexico. You're not going to be able to pick it up and move it. And so it might actually advantage slightly the electric vehicles over internal combustion engines if there's broad tariffs on Canada and Mexico imports. But again, at a huge cost for consumers, it would dramatically increase the price of purchasing new vehicles. And on net, that seems pretty tough.
Just when we're looking strategically at different manufacturing sectors, do you think we should be manufacturing everything here in the US, or are there certain areas, we talked about this before, but like solar panels as an example.
Yeah.
Should we just be allowing countries where they have a lower labor rate to produce those as cheap as possible, which means we allows the US to
here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is the right question we should be asking, and again, why we should be thinking strategically, sector by sector, product by product, rather than broad-based tariffs good, trade deficits bad, right? So I think there's a variety of justifications we could have for why we might want to, focus industrial strategy in the U.S. And one of those is where we see new, important general-purpose technologies that we think are going to spill over to a broader productivity, highly productive manufacturing product sector in the U.S. And I think lithium-ion batteries, you can make the case, are one of those products, right? I mean, batteries just keep getting better and better and cheaper, right? Density goes up, energy density goes up, cost goes down, and we're able to find more and more uses for these batteries. And 10 years from now, they're just going to be in everything. They already pretty much are, but you can see a path where they're energy dense enough that we can actually have hybrid electric aircraft, flying from New York to Chicago, right? That is absolutely impossible today. We can see microelectronic devices that have such a small energy dense battery in them, they can have a whole wearable computer system that's doing all kinds of things for you, right? Monitoring your health or other things. So I just think there's a wide range, and of course a variety of defense applications. I mean, look at the drone-based conflict that's going on in Ukraine and now, that depend on ultralight batteries, right? And so there's a case to be made that we need to have expertise and industrial capacity and innovative activity going on around batteries in the United States. And a good way to do that, because EVs are the biggest source of demand for batteries, is to build up an electric vehicle market and support U.S. Sourcing of battery cells and components. So that's one case. I don't see that case for solar PV. It's not a general purpose technology in that sense. I mean, we will put solar panels probably everywhere, but it's not, the ability to produce a solar cell is not itself broadly applicable in a variety of other sectors, I don't think. But the other motivation is concern about disruption of critical supply chains. And so it may be that it is cheaper to build things abroad, but we all saw what happened when the COVID-19 pandemic blew up supply chains, or when a tsunami hits Japan and wrecks, a whole bunch of the manufacturing capacity. We've built a just-in-time delivery system that's very efficient, very complex, and very spread out, and it's easy to break. And so there are industries that we probably want to have a bit more resilience. That doesn't mean we have to produce all of the demand in the U.S., but we probably want to be able to produce a substantial share of it, whether those are, masks for, for spread of diseases, or solar panels because they're the fastest growing source of electricity in the United States. But I don't think we're going to be exporting those around the world, right? And I would say the third thing is we want to build export-oriented industries. And that I think we have to think very carefully about where we truly can compete with China and where we can't. And
it's a great segue to my two favorite letters that must be on every panel, A and I.
Yeah.
So the current administration has, exerted itself in our AI superiority, which relies on so much of what you were just talking about, and that we actually might become a net exporter of energy due to our AI capacities. That seems like it requires a lot of the grid intelligence that you've been working on, yet it's a juxtaposition to maybe their policies. What are some of the opportunities that you see here, and kind of this shift, towards AI support, and how we in the United States are going to be able to enable that through our grid?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an area where we have a lead at the moment, although I don't know how durable that lead is, right? I mean, we're seeing some more, some more innovative companies coming out of China with new products pretty quickly. It's one of these ones that's hard to tell, right? It's has the potential to be a broad productivity enhancing technology, and that's the kind of thing that drives economic growth in a bunch of unpredictable ways, frankly. Like, I don't know exactly where that's going to go. Does that mean we're going to have much better drug discovery at, pharma companies in New Jersey? Or does that mean that we're going to find a better way to quickly assess who can connect to the grid, in different locations? Or is that going to mean we're going to, find new ways to design, materials that we use to push the boundaries of material science? Like, these are all possibilities. And we don't, it's hard to say exactly where that's going to materialize right now. If it's just a better way to search the internet, I'm not sure that's a huge, broad change. And with the internet more broadly, we see productivity enhancing gains. We also see a lot of productivity wasting gains, right? The amount of time we spend doom scrolling or, spending on social media, right? That's probably not enhancing our productivity all that much. And so on net, some of these technologies could cut both ways, and I think AI could be one of those as well. It could just suck up a lot more electricity to do things that we already do pretty well and could do in different ways. So I think it's an open question right now. Obviously, there's a lot of potential, and the big challenge, I think, from a climate perspective is just that these are, potentially huge new drivers of electricity demand at a pace that we're not yet able to match with new supply. And that's a broader challenge for decarbonization generally, because decarbonization depends on electrification of a bunch of activities that today rely on fossil fuels, whether that's in buildings or in industry or transportation. So I was already expecting demand to grow rapidly just to meet our decarbonization goals, and now you throw AI and data centers on top of that, and that's an even more substantial challenge. And so I think that's the stress point that I'm more focused on now, is less AI for energy or other applications, but more how do we get the energy we need for AI without prolonging the life of coal plants that would otherwise have retired, or installing a lot of new natural gas that gets burnt, natural gas plants that are used frequently. Those are the challenges that we face at the moment.
We've got it behind us. I can't do this without saying it. Do you think drill, baby, drill could mean a renaissance for geothermal and geologic hydrogen, which would help with some of the demand growth that you're talking about?
Yeah, so advanced geothermal is an area that I've been working on for the last 5 years or so. As a research partner of Fervo Energy, which is the leader in enhanced geothermal, and as an advisor to 𝐂𝐕, which is the leader in closed-loop geothermal, sort of two different paths to make geothermal energy for power generation and heat, broadly scalable across the world. And both are moving forward quite well, with first commercial projects online for enhanced geothermal in the US, and online later this year for closed-loop in Germany. These are both technologies that could take geothermal from being a very niche technology today. There's something like 3.5 gigawatts of total geothermal generation in the US now, and maybe we can add a couple more. So it's a sort of a rounding error in a system with 1,000 gigawatts of total peak demand. Advanced geothermal could be a terawatt scale resource, right? 1,000 gigawatt scale resource. And you don't get a new one of those every day, right? There's not, the last one is, nuclear power, or I guess wind turbines maybe a little after that. And so it's really exciting to see this technical progress, and it's interesting politically that it leverages a huge amount of technical innovation and expertise from the oil and gas sector, right? These companies wouldn't be possible without leveraging innovation that's occurred over the last decade or so from shale oil and gas extraction, whether that's magnetic ranging or directional drilling or hydraulic stimulation, which is used in enhanced geothermal to create artificial reservoirs to circulate water through. And so this is an interesting area where the US really does have a huge competitive advantage because we have such a large and effective oil and gas sector, particularly for shale oil and gas, and where we can scale this new industry and to a degree that would be quite material in the longer term. I think, again, the challenge with AI is that, Fervo is going to build a few hundred megawatts of total projects between now and 2028 or something like that, right? It just takes a long time to go from their first 4 megawatt project to being able to crank out tens of gigawatts a year, which is what we need to do, on the grid to meet demand growth and displace existing fossil assets. So all these advanced technologies, whether it's advanced geothermal or advanced nuclear, small modular reactors, long duration storage, these are all coming, and we can see the toolkit that we need forming to get to 100% carbon-free grid, but they're not going to be ready to be deployed at tens of gigawatt scale before 2030, 2032, And so it's this interim point here where there's a tension between, AI and demand growth and our climate goals. Longer term, I think it's quite positive. And I do think the US, the politics in the US are quite favorable for geothermal and for geologic hydrogen, which, leverages the oil and gas sector, direct skill set, direct expertise. And many of the companies, right, many of the oil field services companies are moving into this space. So if there's one area that I would expect to just continue on chugging along during Trump 2.0, it would be geothermal and hydrogen, geologic hydrogen.
So what do you think some of those interim solutions are? Like you mentioned that geothermal is a longer way out.
Yeah.
What can we do right now for some of the load growth that we're seeing?
I mean, the reality is the quickest way to bring new energy onto the grid is with wind and solar. Yeah. And the cheapest way to add some capacity and flexibility is with batteries. We have, as you know, over 3 terawatts of projects waiting in interconnection queues or have submitted, requests to connect to US grids. Again, we have a peak demand of about 1 terawatt. So we've got like 3 times as much as we really need. Now, not all those projects are ever going to get built. Many of them are speculative. But they do all represent places where somebody's put some time into development, thought about whether this could be a commercially viable site, acquired land rights, right, a lease position or something else, and paid some money to try to connect to the grid. So they're not totally fake, and a substantial portion of them, could easily be built over the next 5 years, hundreds of gigawatts of projects. And they're stuck in an antiquated process that was designed to connect a few, natural gas plants a year to the grid, not hundreds of gigawatts and thousands of projects of wind, solar, and batteries. That can't get you cost effectively to 100% carbon-free 24/7. For that, we're going to need to supplement it with some creative emerging technologies in the short term, but it can get you to a 90%, or 85% carbon-free mix. And so if you can use gas capacity, for example, very infrequently in partnership with a bunch of new renewables and storage, and you can do that while continuing to retire the couple hundred gigawatts of coal we still have on the grid, which is the biggest source of air pollution and CO2 emissions, then we could continue to make progress in the short term without too much of an impact on emissions. But we're not going to get there if we just try to rely on existing coal capacity or build a bunch of new gas plants. That's not going to do it. And I should say, people think it's fast to build a new gas plant, and I think they're starting to realize that's not true at all. There's only maybe 10 to 20 gigawatts of gas projects that are in that interconnection queue. Right. And if you're getting in the line now, like you're not going to get out of that queue for a few more years. And just today, ENGIE reported that they're canceling 2 gigawatts of proposed projects in Texas because they can't get turbines. Gas turbines are, there's supply chain limitations for gas turbines too. I've heard anecdotally from a bunch of folks that all of the major OEMs of gas turbines are booked out for years and years. And so if you haven't put your order in, forget it. It's not even an option. So we are in kind of a rock and a hard place moment, and we got to be creative about solutions. And I do think the best way to add lots and lots of capacity and energy to the grid very quickly is with batteries and renewables.
You mentioned while you were saying that, I need to pick up on it, as well as that, also some emergent and creative technologies that are just coming out. What are some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, again, they're not going to be built at large scale, but if you can blend in some advanced geothermal or some multi-day storage, whether that's thermal storage or low-cost electrochemical storage or mechanical storage like compressed air, there's a bunch of companies. There's dozens, you probably in your portfolio, there's dozens of companies out there that are advancing these technologies to market that can build a few hundred megawatts now. And so if you pair that with that couple hundred megawatts with 1.5 gigawatts of wind, solar, and batteries, now you've got a pretty firm product that can meet a data center's demand growth, right? But we're going to have to be targeted and careful about each one and what the right portfolio of resources is. And we do have to lean in, and this is where data centers could be an upside in the longer term, is they could be the demand pull for those technologies. Google was the first off-taker for Fervo's pilot project. They're signed up for another 150 megawatts again to expand that project. Microsoft is backing a variety of companies, including small modular reactor companies. So, the price point that data centers are willing to pay is quite high for reliable power that's clean. And so that can create a demand pull that really helps pull these technologies through, even with the uncertainty around federal policy at the moment. So that's sort of the optimistic read, is that if we are creative about this and we do find ways to pair these emerging resources with mature resources in a smart portfolio, we can meet that growth. And I'd say the last piece of it is demand flexibility. Both of the data centers, which I think can and will have to be more flexible than they already they think they can be, and only a few companies have really started to explore that. They think, think you're going to run your data center 24/7. You might not be able to do that because you might not be able to connect to the grid if you say you're going to do that. But if you're willing to curtail your output, 100 hours a year, it's It's a very different, easier to connect, resource. But even if the data center is 24/7 and you're adding that base load to the demand, there's a lot of very flexible and infrequently used demand that's contributing to the peak that you could unlock as well. So EV charging, for example, there's no reason you should ever charge an EV during peak periods, right? I've got a 90 kilowatt hour battery in my car. That's enough to drive 300 miles. That's like a week's worth of driving, right? So I've got a lot of flexibility about what time of day and even what day of the week to charge that EV if I had the right incentives to do that. Those could shift out of the way. There are other, there's a wide range of demand response, that's signed up in different regions of the country. Very high in California, very low in the southeast, United States, where a lot of these data centers are being proposed. So if you pair a new baseload resource with, another equivalent amount of demand flexibility during the few hours when you really need it, that also can go a long way towards accommodating these without needing to build a bunch of new gas peakers that you probably can't get because you can't get the turbines.
And great segue into a conversation around public utility commissions. Yeah. And we've talked a lot about federal, but actually, you spoke quite recently on, the role of PUCs in the future of energy and what that means for distributed energy. And maybe you could shed some light on that infrastructure and what that means for the next 3 to 5 years, by your take.
So, every state in the country has a utility commission of some sort, sometimes the Public Service Commission, the Utility Board, there are different names, right, that are in charge of regulating the public utilities within the state, and that includes all the electric utilities. Each one is 3 to 5 people, so you've got something like a couple hundred individuals across the country that are directing like $1 trillion of annual expenditures, something like 1% of U.S. GDP, right? And they have a lot of influence over what the utilities can and can't do, varying degrees in different states. And so this is another sort of nexus of planning and decision making and influence, besides the federal government, besides the state legislature, that has a huge amount of influence over how we address this demand growth. How do we unlock that demand flexibility? How do we change rates and incentives for flexible EV charging? Whether or not we permit new gas pipelines to be built or rate-based, or transmission lines to be built and rate-based. And all of that comes down to the utility commissions. And so I got my start working in Oregon as an intervener at the Oregon Public Utilities Commission on behalf of the renewable energy sector. It's a great experience, worked for 2 years, we pretty much won everything, and I was like, this is easy, great. I'm gonna go on and work on federal policy, and that took a little bit longer. But it's an important place to have your voice heard. And that includes a lot of early stage companies that touch on the power sector, which is most every company. Even if you're not providing a solution for the electricity sector, you're probably consuming a lot of electricity in your products. And so having the voice, those voices heard to a greater degree, having individuals and households, heard to a greater degree, can help expand the perspectives that those commissions are hearing from, and ideally balance out some of the very vested interests that are there every day because their business depends on it, whether that's large commercial customers like Walmart or Google, or the utilities themselves whose entire business model is shaped by their decisions. So they have armies of people, right, who are devoted to trying to influence and shape the decisions at the Utility Commission because their whole business depends on it.
So there's a check and balance, maybe?
I mean, theoretically they're supposed to be, right? I mean, the Public Utility Commission is supposed to be acting in the public interest to ensure that electricity rates are reasonable and affordable and that the grid remains reliable. That's their primary purpose, right? And, there are different degrees of capacity that those commissions have. I think one of the shocking facts I learned just this week as we were recording our Shift Key episode on Monday that came out yesterday, is the just broad disparity in how much budget these utility commissions have. So as I said, I got my start in Oregon. Oregon's utility commission, state of about 5.5 million people, has about $100 million a year budget. So they've got a lot of staff they can afford to have. They're experts that can look over the utility's shoulder, can convene discussions with stakeholders, can think creatively about what to do to deal with all of these oncoming challenges that the power sector is facing. Georgia, which has more than twice the population of Oregon, has an order of magnitude less budget. They have $13 million a year. So how are you going to not only just keep the basic functioning of the utility commission going, but also deal with all of these changes that are coming your way? How do we integrate distributed solar? How do we, design tariffs for flexible industrial consumers? How do we, site data centers? Who pays for that upgrade? I mean, all of these new questions they're facing on top of their normal day-to-day work. So they are very understaffed, and that does lead to an inability to act as the full check that they're meant to be. Sometimes that's deliberate, right? And regulatory capture and legislative capture by the utilities in those states keep the budget small because it's a lot easier for them.
This is an opportunity, though, for those who are passionate about
Yeah.
and determined for energy transition. I mean, you said, I'm going to quote you from that episode.
Yeah.
You said, "It's shocking how many early-stage tech investors, I count myself as one of these, in the electricity industry are unaware their voices can be heard and they can shape what happens in these PUCs."
Yep. Yeah, I mean, they all have various public forums at which your voice can be directly heard. You can also engage with staff in various ways that are directly relevant to your interests or your companies. Sometimes this is just fundamental to your business model. Say you're a company that is developing a strategy for coordinating smart thermostats, right, to provide flexibility. And you might think, well, I'm going to launch in the US market. There is no US market for power. There's 50 different states, and even within those states, you've got publicly owned utilities that do their own thing. You've got a couple of investor-owned utilities that have slightly different flavors that report to the utility commission, right? And so there isn't one market. There's a hugely balkanized market, and your route to the market goes through each of these utility commissions. But again, even if you're just a consumer of that electricity and you need reliable, low cost, and want clean energy to power your business, they're the ones in charge of making that happen. So so having your voices heard there is really important, and also thinking about implications for your business model as you're scaling these companies, of not active, if you don't actively engage there, right?
So I want to talk a bit about startups. There are many startups probably in the room, certainly investors in the room. A lot of them are having DOE loans, grants potentially retreat in this environment.
Yeah.
Which ones, which industries, or which particular companies do you think are going to be safer versus more at risk? We touched on this a little bit earlier, but also interested to understand, like, what other areas of support are you starting to see maybe at state level?
Yeah. I mean, this again is the area that's just so shocking to think that the government would not honor a existing contract. And I do think at the end of the day they will. I don't, again, can't guarantee that they're not going to force a constitutional crisis, but the courts are regularly saying, look, you can't do that. A lot of that is under constitutional law, the idea that, Congress says what to spend the money on, that's their job, and the, president executes that faithfully. They're pushing back against that, and the courts have, again, pushed back and said no. But there's also just a lot of contract law, right? That isn't a constitutional question at all. It's just you wrote a contract, it says you're going to do the thing you're going to do, you got to do the thing you're going to do, otherwise contracts aren't worth the paper they're printed on. So I do think at the end of the day we're going to, not tear up the idea that, federal government has to honor its contracts, at least I hope, because that's just that would fundamentally shake the credibility of the US government and the economy as a whole. But it's going to take some time to get there, because they clearly are, using a sort of move fast and break things mentality that Elon Musk and others from Silicon Valley are sort of bringing into the administration. In terms of which ones will be safer, I mean, I think if you look at the text of the executive orders that came out on day one, you get a pretty good sense of the ideological commitments of this administration. And while they say they might want energy dominance and low-cost energy prices, if you look at how they actually define that, right, it's, you'd think that, let's go build a lot of wind and solar and lower energy prices for companies right across the country. But if you look at the definition of an energy resource in that text, it explicitly excludes or implicitly excludes solar and wind. Which again, I have to add, are the fastest growing sources of electricity in the country by far, and the cheapest. So you want energy, you want to dominate, you want to have cheap supply, you want to have businesses that are competitive, have access to competitively priced electricity, you want those things to get built, but that's not what they're saying their goal is. They want to get a lot more oil and gas production, which we already have too much of, right? The constraint on oil and gas production right now is not government policy, it's that the price of oil is too low because demand is plateauing globally. Right. I think you can look at those texts to get a sense of where they want to go, and I think geothermal and advanced nuclear, anything related to the fossil sector is safer than not. But at the end of the day, hopefully, if you've got a grant commitment that has been made, that they will honor that grant commitment, eventually. It does mean new grants that, you might have been counting on non-dilutive funding from 𝐅𝐵 or DOE or something in the future. That, I think, it's a lot less certain, right? And I think you have to pivot and think carefully about alternative strategies. You mentioned states. I mean, there's also other countries. The good news is that the commitment to, the direction of travel is not changing, right? The commitment to decarbonize the world is strong. It's continuing. It makes economic sense. And a lot of jurisdictions, there's a lot of different jurisdictions out there that you can shop in to figure out where you want to launch your product. And if you're small and early stage, like, you don't need an enormous market to succeed and get off the ground, right? You don't need the entire US federal market. And you don't need the policy support necessarily of the federal government. If you find a state that's gung-ho about this, that could be sufficient. If you can't find it here, you can go to Canada, you can go to Europe. I mean, that's what whatever is doing. They have this closed-loop geothermal project. It's not cost competitive with cheap power in the US because we have so much cheap gas. It is cost competitive with very expensive gas-derived power and heat in Europe right now. And Germany has a firm commitment, right, to decarbonize. And so their first project is there, and they're receiving funding, I think 135 million euros from the German government to demonstrate there. So I think carefully about sort of venue shopping. Where is the most amenable, environment from a policy perspective for your firms? And unfortunately, that may mean we lose jobs and we lose innovation, we lose economic investment to other countries. But for your interest, that's what we have to, you have to do if you're a startup, right? And there are states that I think are going to push back, and we saw this during the first administration. There's sort of this thermostatic effect that's kind of a part of the polarization of American politics now, where if you have a party in control in Washington, the other party that controls state government tends to do a lot of stuff in the other direction, right, to try to counter that and show that they're moving forward with the party's priorities. And that went both ways, right? When Biden was in charge, there was a lot of efforts at the state level that Republicans implemented that were meant to go the other way. But we saw during the first Trump administration a lot of commitment to clean energy at the state level, and that even continued through the Biden years. And I think we'll probably see that again, right? I mean, California is committed to its electric vehicle transition. They may or may not be able to sustain the EPA waiver for clean trucks and clean cars. If they don't, they'll come up with something else, right? They're not going to stop. Massachusetts has said, we're done with natural gas for heating buildings, right? We're not going to continue to invest in our gas grid. They had a big, long future of gas proceeding, and they said, you know what? We're going to wind this thing down, right? We're not going to cut it off tomorrow, but we're not going to keep building it out, and we're going to switch to geothermal, and we're going to switch to electric heat pumps. So that is going to continue and maybe accelerate, right? And other states could follow that path. And Minnesota, the Department of Commerce in Minnesota has proposed that they layer onto their 100% renewable portfolio standard, clean energy standard for 100% clean electricity, a requirement that they start meeting hour by hour demand with clean electricity, something that data center owners like Google and Microsoft have also done. And that basically acts as a demand pull for these innovative new technologies. Because again, you can't get there with just wind, solar, and lithium-ion batteries. You need to sprinkle in some of this other stuff. And so if a state like Minnesota does that, that becomes the place to go if you're one of these companies that's going to launch a long-duration storage technology or an advanced nuclear plant or a heat battery or whatever it is. And I expect we'll see a lot more of that from other states over the next few years too. Maybe not that specific policy, but that kind of effort to carve out an area where they want to be leaders. Another one is Colorado last year implemented the first demand pull subsidy for hydrogen, clean hydrogen adoption. Whereas the federal incentive is just subsidized supply. They implemented a standard subsidy for users of hydrogen within the state, as an example. And again, that could be done in other places.
Amazing. So at Zero, have you revised your kind of research mission given everything going on? And if you had to give us in a crystal ball kind of 2-3 years down the road, what would you envision? And what are you researching?
Yeah, I mean, I was already in the process of sort of transitioning, and to some degree, our research focus, and that's for kind of two reasons. One is the focus I've had for the last 5+ years, even pre my role at Princeton, is on decarbonizing the power sector and on federal policy to support decarbonization. And the good news is those are both in pretty good shape if we can keep it, right? When I started at Renewable Northwest in 2006, if you could find a wind farm for around $100 a megawatt hour, that was a great deal. we didn't even think about deploying utility scale solar because it was $500 a megawatt hour or $400 a megawatt hour, right? And there were no EVs, right? None. I did my undergrad thesis on ways to decarbonize and reduce oil consumption in transportation, and the vision then was like, maybe plug-in hybrids eventually will get batteries good enough for that, and we'll run them on cellulosic ethanol, Fast forward to now, right? And the cost of wind has fallen by 75%. It's $30 to $50 a megawatt hour. The cost of solar has fallen by an order of magnitude, right? And the cost of lithium-ion batteries has fallen by an order of magnitude, and now they're the cheapest way to add flexibility to the grid, and EVs are the cheapest way to add mobility service, right? Around the world, not just in the US, right? If you go around the world now, whether it's Pakistan or Nigeria or elsewhere, and you're a small business owner and you want to keep the lights on more than the grid operator will provide you with, which is usually bad, you do that with solar and batteries now. If you want to get your product to market, you do that with a 3-wheel electric trike or a 2-wheel electric scooter, right? And if you're going to run a bus in Kenya, you do that with an electric bus. So we've just completely transformed the economics here in a way that gives us so many different options. So it's not that we're done with that transition. There's still lots of challenges. We'll still continue to engage in that. And we, of course, now have comprehensive federal climate policy for the first time ever, if we can keep it. So my focus has shifted a bit to how does electricity touch on industry and buildings and heating, right? So areas where we have other options besides electricity, but where electrification is going to play a major role, and therefore the power sector is going to become integrated closely with these sectors in ways that I think we have capabilities we can help in our research. And so we're building economy-wide models that cover all energy and industrial sectors, and that are designed, that are using new algorithmic methods that we've developed to increase the temporal resolution of those models, because there are models that exist like that. But they tend to not have the resolution you need in the power sector to accurately represent electricity and all the fluctuations of wind and solar on fast timescales. So we're building models that can do that and can cover the scope of the whole economy. And we'll be releasing an open source, first version of that this summer. And so we'll be using that to look at industrial decarbonization strategies and building electrification and strategies to mitigate winter peak demand on the grid, because that is really the stress point for if we're going to electrify heat, particularly in northern regions, even in New Jersey. We're on the border of that. And then we're also trying to work a lot more with partners at research institutions around the world, in China and India and Brazil and South Korea and Poland and other countries that are at a different stage in their transition and have very unique challenges, right? We're all trying to go in the same direction, but what that looks like in China looks fundamentally different than what that looks like in South Korea or Poland or the United States. And so it's a fun challenge to think through these systems transitions in different contexts, but we're trying to leverage the expertise we've developed doing that for the United States with the Net Zero America study and the repeat project we've run, the modeling tools and approaches that we've developed. So we're at Princeton, we've launched this Net Zero X initiative to kind of replicate that type of study with partners around the world, where the partners are the ones leading those studies, right? I'm not going to be able to provide decision support in countries around the world. The researchers there are the ones that are going to do that, but we have tools and we can collaborate and we can support those efforts and kind of provide the study model for that. So we're actively doing that now, and it's been fun to work with top researchers at peer institutions around the world to think through. I mean, just as one crazy fact that I learned just this week, the iron and steel sector in China produces twice as much emissions as its entire transportation sector. Like here, the #1 emitting sector is transportation. So like in my mind, that's the big bogey, right? And China's making enormous progress on the EV transition, right? Over half of vehicles sold are plug-in hybrids and fully electric vehicles now. Their oil demand is probably peaked, right? Way earlier than we expected. But even then, that's 8% of their emissions, and iron and steel is like 17%. Whereas it's like 2% here. So it's a completely different context. And they're at a different stage in their development of the built environment, and they don't have scrap steel available in the way that we do. And so they're just very interesting challenges. And they demand different solutions from technology and innovation too. So they're fun to look at.
That is a whole talk in itself.
Yeah.
For another time.
Yes.
I mean, So we did have a question from abroad, since we're not opening it up to the audience, but we are going to welcome everybody to drinks, and we will invite that. But we did have a question for you.
Okay.
The new DOE secretary, Wright, given his worldview and experience, what arguments might you make with him on how we can move forward collectively?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think about that specifically recently, I guess. I mean, I would say two things. I mean, I'd say one, if you truly are committed to American energy dominance, it should be all forms of energy, right? And the ones that need the most government support are not the oil and gas sector, and he knows that, right? He knows ran Liberty Energy. He knows where the industry is at. He knows the reason that we're not producing even more oil, even though we're producing record amounts, is that there's just not the price in the market to support that additional production. The real challenge is in the grid, where we're coming out of a period of basically stagnant demand growth for the last 20 years into a new era of quite rapid demand growth. 3%, 4%, 5% per year could be the norm over the next decade. And so the real potential energy crisis is not in the price at the pump or in the production of oil and gas. It's in how do we add enough resources to the grid that we can power all this demand growth, and that's both decarbonization, but it's also the future of industrial sectors, right? It's semiconductor fabs, it's AI, it's advanced manufacturing. So I would say, focus the Department of Energy and the government's efforts on energy dominance in the power sector, right? Not just in oil and gas production. And I probably would talk to him about how we can leverage the expertise of the oil and gas sector in these sectors, something he knows as well because he's an investor in Fervo, or his company is, I should say. So that's an area where the DOE can facilitate technology transfer, from the fossil sector into into geologic hydrogen and geothermal production and other applications, including thermal storage in boreholes and in aquifers and things like that, and CO2 storage, right, and which is also directly leverages all of those skill sets. So highlight the areas where we've got some alignment, and there's quite a bit. So in an ideal world, I'll give you the optimistic read, right? We get through this crazy chaotic period of the initial ransacking of the current, of the previous administration and setting up for the new one, and things settle out a bit, and the agencies get back to writing their checks and honoring their contracts, and 85% of the funding from the IRA does go out to the people who deserved it. Congress, which has very little margin for error, to do any policy changes, doesn't make any substantial repeals or changes to the IRA tax credits. And there are areas where this administration, if they focus on the things they, at least at the high level, say they care about, could make substantial progress, right, in deploying more energy, period, the cheapest and most rapid form of which happens to be building wind and solar. We'll see if that's where we end up. I was more optimistic about that 30 days ago than I am now, but I do think that's still a real possibility.
And so it is. Jesse, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
And I would like to give a round of applause for on this snowy evening.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap. That was the first ever Deep Tech Live from SOSV. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. And do feel free to stick around. You can ask questions. You can try and corner Jesse before he runs off. There'll be refreshments at the back. Thank you all for coming.